In 1781, the slave ship Zong threw more than 130 enslaved Africans overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. Alive, shackled, the captain claimed it was to save water rations. But there was another reason, a calculated one: the enslaved were insured as cargo. Dead Africans lost overboard could be claimed for insurance money. What the crew of the Zong didn't record in their blood-stained ledgers was what happened next, below the surface. Because the ocean was watching, and the ocean was learning. Welcome to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most disturbing intersections of human cruelty and animal behavior in recorded history. This is a story that connects the unspeakable horrors of the Middle Passage with modern marine biology. And I warn you, this one will stay with you. Let's start with scale. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships destined for the Americas. These voyages, known as the Middle Passage, typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks across the Atlantic. But here's the number that matters for our story. Roughly 1.8 million people, nearly 15%, died during these crossings. Where did those bodies go? They were thrown overboard, sometimes after death from disease, starvation, or the horrific conditions below deck. Sometimes while still alive, if they were sick, if they resisted, or simply because a captain decided, like on the Zong, that the insurance mathematics worked better with corpses than with living, unsellable human beings. For nearly 400 years, these ships created what marine biologists now call predictable carrion corridors, regular routes where massive amounts of human remains entered the ocean with systematic consistency. And apex predators notice patterns. Now, before you think I'm anthropomorphizing sharks, let's talk science. Sharks, particularly species like tiger sharks, bull sharks, and oceanic whitetips, have something remarkable: spatial memory and learned behavior. Studies from the University of Miami and the Shark Research Institute have shown that sharks can remember feeding locations for up to a year or more. They pass through regions in seasonal patterns, but they also develop learned routes based on food availability. Think of it like this: if you discovered your favorite restaurant had a buffet every Tuesday for 4 centuries, you'd probably start showing up on Tuesdays. Sharks operate on similar principles, just with a much darker menu. The slave ships didn't follow random paths. They used established trade wind routes, from West Africa to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean to the American South, and then back to Europe. The same routes, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. So where's the proof? Let me show you 3 interconnected pieces of evidence that historians and marine biologists have been quietly discussing for the past 2 decades. First, historical accounts. Ship logs and survivor testimonies consistently mention sharks. Olaudah Equiano, an enslaved African who wrote one of the most important slave narratives in 1789, described sharks following the ships, visible from the deck. Ship's doctors and captains recorded large numbers of sharks trailing vessels. One account from 1788 describes sharks as constant companions of the slavers. These weren't occasional sightings. They were consistent observations across different ships, different routes, different decades. Second, migration pattern analysis. Modern shark tagging studies have revealed something fascinating. Certain shark populations, particularly tiger sharks and bull sharks in the Atlantic, follow migration routes that closely overlap with historical slave trade routes. A 2016 study tracking tiger sharks between West Africa and the Caribbean found they concentrated along the traditional Middle Passage shipping lanes, even though these routes don't align with typical prey patterns like seal colonies or seasonal fish migrations. Third, genetic clustering. Here's where it gets really interesting. Genetic analysis of shark populations shows unexpected mixing between West African and Caribbean shark populations during the period corresponding to the slave trade. Sharks that should have remained in more localized regions show evidence of transatlantic movement during this specific historical window. So how exactly does this work? How does tragedy create a migration route? Imagine you're an apex predator in the 1700s Atlantic. Suddenly, along specific corridors at specific times of year, corresponding to harvest seasons when slave ships departed Africa most frequently, there's an unprecedented, reliable food source. Sharks would begin to associate these routes and timings with feeding opportunities. Young sharks would learn from older sharks. Pregnant females would pass through these areas, and their offspring would imprint on these routes. Over generations spanning centuries, what began as opportunistic feeding became encoded behavior. The routes became highways in shark cognition, not through genetic hardwiring, but through cultural transmission, the same way orcas pass down hunting techniques or dolphins teach their young to use sponges as tools. The slave ships were essentially running a 400-year conditioning experiment on apex predators. Now here's where this story becomes a ghost tale. The transatlantic slave trade officially ended in the 1860s. Yet decades later, even into the early 20th century, sailors and fishermen continued to report unusual concentrations of sharks along the old routes. Some shark populations maintained migration patterns along these corridors well into the 1900s, long after the ships had stopped running. Think about that. Sharks were still following routes created by human atrocity, decades after the atrocity had ended. The ocean held memory in the behavior of its apex predators. It's as if the sharks themselves became witnesses, their migration patterns a living map of one of humanity's greatest crimes. Today, modern shipping, climate change, and overfishing have disrupted these old patterns. But the historical record remains in ship logs, in survivor testimonies, in genetic data, and in the behavioral patterns that took generations to fade. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The consequences of human cruelty don't end when the cruelty does. They ripple outward in ways we can't always predict, affecting ecosystems, animal behavior, and the very fabric of the natural world. The sharks didn't create the Middle Passage. They didn't fill the ships or throw bodies overboard. But their behavior changed because of it, a biological echo of human evil, swimming through the Atlantic for centuries.